Welcome to the Thrivology Lab podcast, where we explore the science, philosophy, and practice of thriving. Our goal is to help you create a happier and healthier life through education, application, and transformation. Your co-hosts on this journey are Neil Utterbeck, that's me.
And Phil Dunwoody, that's me. Neil and I are both on the faculty at Juniata College, where we teach courses to promote human thriving and well-being. So today's topic is about interacting with real people in real time. We're briefly going to discuss kind of some of what we know about humans as what I refer to as being a social animal. We're going to talk about some of the brain research demonstrating just how kind of deeply social we actually are. A little bit about kind of finding your tribe, highlighting some things from the book Tribe. And a little bit about kind of what we know about some particularly happy societies and how social connections relates to that. Some things about trust, and then, might see the other side of it in terms of social isolation, social rejection, and kind of the cost on our mental health. And we'll briefly touch on aging and social media use. Like I think every podcast we've done, when Neil and I pick these topics, these are these broad categories that are kind of in our model of well-being, which we have yet to fully reveal. Right? You have to stay tuned for that. We will, once we hit each of the main topics, we'll loop back around and then talk about the overall model. But one of the things I think this is a good thing in terms of the future of the podcast. Any one of these kind of subcategories we have within today's podcast could easily be its own episode.
And I think, too, one of the things that as you're listening, you're probably noticing that, as a model, this is, and we've said this before, is a systems approach. So well-being, thriving, it's a system of interactions between all these things. And so, you often see like a book on a subject say like, okay, mindfulness, that's the single thing, or nutrition, that's the single thing. And so sleep, or whatever it is that tends to dive in, and it's challenging to look at it from a systems approach because every topic becomes its own rabbit hole.
Yeah.
But I think that's also part of the excitement that you and I have even just working on this podcast or the class or just in our lives in general of digging into these things and looking at how deeply it all goes.
Yeah. And so do you want to talk about kind of one other model of well-being, this one we've used in class a little bit, it's different from ours in some ways, but it gets at this systems level approach in terms of what's in it.
Yeah. So when Phil and I were developing our course at Juniata, The Ways of Wellbeing, we started with Martin Seligman, who's like a powerhouse in the positive psychology movement. His model, known as PERMA, and PERMA is an acronym that stands for Positive Emotion, Engagement, Relationships, Meaning, and Achievement. And as we were working on it, it's a great model. And some people have added an H on that to include health aspects of it. And so as Phil and I were developing our own model, we often sort of referenced even Seligman's model because we initially used it. But I bring it up here because I think it would be hard when you look at different models of well-being, it would be hard to take relationships out of that. His PERMA model doesn't really include nutrition, right? Doesn't really include sleep. And we find it really important to our model of thriving. But relationship crosses all these because it's just that fundamental to who we are.
Yeah, and on that kind of fundamental point, this is, I mentioned something in one of the other podcasts about how in biology there's kind of the saying that nothing makes sense in the absence of evolution. Right. And as a psychologist, I approach understanding human behavior as understanding us, at least in part from this kind of evolutionary lens. And a big part of that is that we are social animals, right? We did not evolve to function in isolation. We evolved to function in small groups, tribes, and that is, that arguably is our big evolutionary advantage. We don't have huge teeth. We don't have big claws, right? There is not a whole lot physically that is scary about us. And our big brains do lots of amazing things, but really those amazing things come from us being able to work together in social groups to coordinate, right? So from a hunter-gatherer perspective, you have just that. You have hunting, right, and the ability to coordinate among multiple people and plan ahead. And but you move that into kind of agricultural society and the ability to, again, kind of coordinate, really having kind of symbolic systems of exchange money, right? We often talk about things that are subjective and objective, but a lot of cultural beliefs are things that we've made up, but that we all agree are real, right? So intersubjective reality is how some people refer to these things. That's only possible because we are an incredibly social species. So it is our socialness that has allowed us to thrive and take over every environment on this planet. Right. This is our evolutionary advantage. So if you think about us as a species, we're about 300,000 years old. It's only 10,000 years ago that we developed agriculture. And what that means is that about 97% of our existence was really in hunter-gatherer societies. And so if you want to think kind of, well, what did our social system evolve to function in? That's where we spent the vast majority of our time as a species. And that would be small groups of 25 to 50 people that might then coordinate with a few other smaller groups to have a total tribe of 100 to 150 people. And we see this from kind of looking at kind of current hunter-gatherer societies, what our estimates are of past hunter-gatherer societies. It also comes out of something called Dunbar's number. Robin Dunbar is a British anthropologist, and he estimated social group size based on some measurement of brain and cortex, and essentially looking at primates. How big of a social group can you exist in, given certain brain regions and their complexity? Looking at other primates, he said, for humans, you should expect us to be able to have meaningful relationships with about 150 people as a limit. And so this is actually used in when people talk about businesses, organizations. You can't expect people to have, again, meaningful social relationships with more than that. So, we talk about now like I have 400 friends on Facebook. Right. Well, I mean, how deep are really those connections? Those are not meaningful connections where I actually know things about the people, where there's kind of trust, where there's cooperation. And so this is the environment we evolved to function in.
Well, I think that goes to that, disambiguation of real people, real time.
Yes,
like, what are we talking about, that realness? Because, the quality, what I think is binding a lot of the things we're talking about are the quality of these relationships. It's not the quantity, it's the quality, that meaningfulness that you bring up.
Yeah, there's even research showing that just having one really close, they phrase the question something like, if you needed to call someone at 3 a.m. and talk about, some emergency or something incredibly important in your life, do you have someone you could call? Mm-hmm. And just that yes/no response is actually predictive of a lot of kind of well-being measures and health metrics. And so
that goes back to your hunter-gatherer tribal life. Like, your survival was the tribe's survival and vice versa. You needed those people. And so it makes sense that need, and that we're going to talk later about trust and things, that ability to know these people deeply and trust them would have been the difference between life and death. So it makes sense that it would be hardwired then into our development.
Right, because sickness happens, not just sickness, but babies are born essentially helpless, right? They literally depend on the adults around them for their survival. And so we are hardwired to take care of people around us, to care for people around us. So sometimes there's this idea that we're this selfish, every man for himself kind of thing. That's not a real accurate view of humanity. It's not how we evolved. It is not how we function best. And we actually do really, really poorly in terms of mental health and physical health when we are socially isolated. It's actually a really big risk factor for all kinds of mental health things. So you can see this in this kind of emerging area of now we call social neuroscience, sometimes called social cognitive neuroscience, looks at kind of what do we know about brain regions and how they respond to social rejection, social connection. And some of this research, I got to shout out. I tell my students it's not stealing if you reference, right? So I'm referencing here Matthew Lieberman's book. This is a 2013 publication, but it's still an excellent book called Social: Why Our Brains Are Wired to Connect. He's on the faculty at UCLA. And Hygge does a really nice overview of a lot of this research that I'm going to mention here just briefly. We talked in the mindfulness episode about the default mode network. And this area of the brain got its name from early neuroimaging studies before they had any idea what it did. And it got this name because as they're doing these, this was kind of early cognitive neuroscience where they would give you math problems, they'd give you attention problems, memory problems, these different tasks to do in the what's either a functional magnetic resonance imaging machine or positron emission tomography. And both of these techniques are ways to see what's happening in a living brain. All right, so before this, we really had to wait till people experienced brain injury, traumatic brain injury, or they died, right? And then there was sometimes dissecting the individual if they were donated to science. That's how we knew things about the brain kind of cognitive connection, mind-brain connection. But with positron emission tomography, functional magnetic resonance imagery, we can actually see inside a living brain and see what's active, right? So we have things like regular MRIs or even CAT scans can show you about brain structure. The positron emission tomography or functional magnetic resonance imaging, these are things that show you brain activity. And so how do they do that? Just in a nutshell, they essentially track in one way or another blood flow. The areas of your brain that you're using, well, they use energy. And that energy is brought to those areas of the brain through blood. And so if you can track blood flow in the brain, you can track energy use in the brain, which is essentially tracking activation, which part are people using. So they're doing this with, again, memory tasks, attention tasks, problem-solving tasks, all the typical things that cognitive psychologists do. But while you're in the machine, there's some amount of downtime because attention only lasts so long. You have to give people breaks. And they would give people breaks, right? And this is your rest time. You've got 30 minutes, you got 60 seconds to rest, whatever it is. And then they noticed that the same region was repeatedly lighting up during these rest periods. So they just named it the default mode network, right? Is because it's what comes on by default. They didn't know what it was though. And then it became pretty easy to tell because then they just started asking people during that period, what were you thinking about? All right. So it's basically a self-report protocol. And what became clear is that most of the time what people we're thinking about is they're thinking about themselves and their interactions with other people. So they might have been recalling a past conversation, right? I had this what did that person mean, right? Parsing something. We all do this, right? We call it rumination if we do it, at some excessive level, or simulating. Right. So, and then we all do this. We imagine future conversations with people. Right. So I have a big event on Saturday. I'll be talking with the board of trustees as in my faculty rep position. And I'm simulating what I'm going to say. It's a way to practice. It's a way to rehearse. Right. So, and we know from the mindfulness research that too much of that is actually bad. Right. In other words, the more time you spend doing those things, the more you tend to have symptoms of anxiety and depression. But it doesn't mean you shouldn't be doing any of it, right? That these are actually very useful things to understand better what someone else is thinking, to plan for your own behavior in the future. So the point here is that our default mode activation, our default mode network, when asked to rest, what do we spend our time doing? We spend our time thinking about our interactions with other people. Right? This is why, in a way, or what people argue is that we do this so that we can better understand the motivations of other people, so we can better express our own motivations and desires, because it's complicated. You know how easy it is to misinterpret someone else's messages or to be misinterpreted, and you want to express yourself in a way that often maximizes some harmony in the group, right? You don't want to be disruptive. You worry about that. These are ways in which we are highly social animals.
Something I'm just thinking of literally on the fly as you're talking, we talked about how mindfulness can sort of reduce the activation of the default mode.
Yes.
But I wonder too, and I don't have an answer to this yet, but this will add to our to-do list.
Yeah.
For future episodes, but we're going to talk later about trust. And I wonder if higher levels of trust also deactivate the default network. Like if part of that rumination is because I don't know or don't trust how this situation is going to go, I have to play it out imaginatively. That's curious.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I think this is why what we would call overactivation of that network is associated with an anxiety and depression, because it is essentially excessive worrying. And so maybe it makes sense that the more secure you would feel, the more comfortable you would feel with yourself and in your relationships,
right,
that the less time you might spend ruminating. And I think, anecdotally, when you're experiencing some friction or some tension in some relationship, you spend so much energy
time, right?
thinking about it, right? This is what we do. And fascinating, this default mode network is active in 2-day-old infants, but not premature born babies. So it even seems that evolution has triggered this system to activate roughly at the moment of birth, right? So the big picture takeaway from this is that our brains are wired to be social. When given free time, it is what we default to. It's what we do.
And it goes back to sort of speculating on the why. Why would that develop at birth? Like it is now the first time you deliberately need something from somebody else that you aren't literally connected to.
And dependent on for your survival, right? So this both in terms of expressing the need, right? And babies, of course, do this through cries of help when they feel discomfort. And then we are wired to respond to these. And this is why when you're stuck on an airplane with a screaming child, it grates on your nerves so much because you're wired to respond to it, right? It's frustrating to have to essentially feel another human in pain and have to listen to it for long periods of time and not be able to do anything about it, right? We're as social animals, we want to reduce suffering in those around us. It is healthy, it is natural, and it's normal. And this gets, this is evolution would select for this tendency because it is working in a social group that makes us strong. It is our tribal nature. Right, and this is a good transition to the book Tribe, I think.
Right. Yeah, so I highly recommend this book. It's Tribe by Sebastian Hygge. Hygge is a journalist and author, and he really got a lot of his prominent start working on veterans and PTSD. And one of the things that he brought attention to was the fact that a lot of these soldiers were coming back from war. They had PTSD. They were suffering from this, but they wanted to go back. And people couldn't figure out, why would you want to go back to this thing that caused you so much trauma? But the thing that he was noticing time and time again were these soldiers saying that they had this sort of tribal, this brotherhood or sisterhood, or this deep connection to other people. And so Hygge starts looking into this sort of across history. And one of the other things he found out that I find really fascinating was 18th century colonial America. You have these British coming over, setting up on the east coast of America, and we have multiple accounts of people from the colonies leaving to go join Indian tribes. But we have no accounts, to my knowledge, of the opposite happening, that no one left the Indian tribes to join the sort of British colonies. And even when it was usually men. So when a man left the colonies to join the tribe and was sort of quote unquote rescued by their British people brought back to the colonies, they would escape again. There's a great quote from Benjamin Franklin. Says, though ransomed by their friends and treated with all imaginable tenderness to prevail and stay among the English, yet in a short time they became disgusted with our manner of life and take the first good opportunity of escaping again into the woods. And because I'm also a playwright, I find this word, the choice of disgusted with this modern life, this manner of life, like that they were finding what we see, and here you have this very curious case study where you have an example of sort of modernity in the British and these Indian tribes who have lived in the same traditional ways since the Stone Age. They've had the same practices, their sexual norms, their dress codes, all far more lenient. They have an egalitarian society. It's built on trust, not just on external laws, but they depend on each other. And so things like stealing, taking more than your fair share, murder or violence against somebody in the tribe were condemnable offenses. And yes, in sort of the British, that was true, but you lose, I think, when you start expanding to such, you have to put these sort of artificial external laws onto a thing, and you don't have this bond that my survival and your survival are codependent in the same way.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I'm thinking of also that we talk about in cross-cultural psychology are differences between collectivism and individualism.
Right.
And we see this often. A lot of the research is done looking at East Asian societies and then Western societies. But I think it would apply to kind of Native American societies like you're talking about as well. The collectivistic societies, what it sounds like, there is a greater emphasis on social relationships. And in Western society, we often think, well, what do you want? And you need to find out what you want, and you need to state it, and you need to go and do it. And that's actually held up as a value in terms of individualism. In more collectivistic societies, that is viewed as childish and selfish because you're expected actually to be more sensitive to the group needs. And not be just focused on what you want, right? And so there is I think an extent where the hyper individualism can also lead us to feel isolated and alone. I don't think it's an example, for example, or an accident that things like existentialism and these worries about meaning and purpose and social isolation come out of a Western tradition that is also much more individualized.
Well, and Younger talks a lot about this, and it was essentially you and I talk about sort of the modern world has engineered a lot of these things out of our lives, and partly what we have to do is sort of re-engineer or de-engineer them back. And one of the things he talks about is one of the things that sort of, particularly to your point, sort of global West lifestyle makes many of us feel unnecessary. We don't feel useful or necessary to our society. Our role seems superfluous in many ways. And that feeling, he writes, here's a great quote from Tribe. Younger writes, human beings need three basic things in order to be content. They need to feel competent at what they do, they need to feel authentic in their lives, and they need to feel connected to others. These three values are considered intrinsic to human happiness and far outweigh extrinsic values such as beauty, money, and status. And we'll see that play out when we talk about some of the other countries that we're going to look at, that intrinsic need to feel connected, when it's part of a social or cultural identity, leads to these far happier outcomes.
Yeah, and this is one area where I think modern life in the West is different from traditional life in the West, in that, you and I are great examples of that. We don't live near home, right? We don't live near the families we grew up with and the friends we grew up with, and that creates some distance from from the others that mattered in our lives for so long, where traditionally we would have grown up in a town, died in that same town. Of course, that can feel limiting and confining, but it also brings with it this kind of greater sense of connectedness with others.
I'll tell you, even anecdotally, I grew up in all of my family, my mother and father's family, are from northern Indiana, and all of my aunts and uncles and cousins and everybody stayed in pretty much that same confined area. And my nuclear family, my father, mother, and sister, we moved away. And that was actually a pretty significant point of contention in our extended family that we were the ones that left. We left, and when we were the ones that had to come back for family reunions or Christmas or Thanksgiving, and there was always, I was as a cousin always sort of an outsider. I didn't have relationships with the other cousins. I didn't know them. I didn't go to school with them, and so even that's in our lifetimes, some of this shifting and moving out. And certainly we've seen since the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, people moving into cities, moving away from life. But this spread across the nation, the planet, away from those sort of familial homes is recent.
Yeah, and especially once you bring things like raising children, childbearing age, you wind up with more of these issues as well, because it's incredibly taxing. And even having two involved parents can be really difficult. So after a woman gives birth, the postpartum depression is incredibly common, because there's this kind of roller coaster that your hormones go through. My wife is a labor and delivery nurse, and so she knows actually a whole lot about this. And again, kind of in a more traditional society, if you are surrounded by people you grew up with, you have this kind of extended network of family and friends, they can support you during this time to help care for you, help care for the baby. Where if you as a family have moved across the country to take a job somewhere, you don't have that network. It can be very isolating and feel very lonely.
When Younger talks about this in Tribe as well, like in tribal cultures, it's not uncommon for babies, children, and even young adolescents to continue sleeping in the same bed with the parents in close physical proximity. And, in the global West, we typically immediately put a baby into a crib, isolate them away.
Right, and this gets back to that collectivistic individualism. We think it's a value that they learn to be independent, which is ridiculous when you're talking about like a 3-month-old infant. There's no way that infant can be independent, and it can actually be. It's really actually bad for their health to be forced into that isolation, because they interpret that, correctly so, as threat. Right? Because again, evolutionarily, being left alone when you know you are helpless
and cold and hungry.
Yep. So the skin. So now, after a baby is born, they emphasize this skin-to-skin contact between the mother and child, and this is done because it actually helps regulate the baby's heartbeat. It helps with all these kind of hormones that flood through our body. It basically helps regulate the mother's systems, the baby's systems. And again, this is just what we evolved to function in, and to take us out of that really brings dysregulation, right? It literally puts the children at larger risk of death, sudden infant death syndrome, by kind of not cohabitating with their parents in bed early on.
So go for it.
Yeah, no, I was going to ask you. So what do we know about? I know we talk in our course about there are measures of how happy a society is that are used at a global level. And some of these point particularly to kind of Nordic countries. And what do we know about the importance of social networks in those countries, and why they seem to score so high on happiness and well-being?
Well, I think, too, as we're talking, it can be easy to parse these things out. Whether we're going to talk later about sort of competition and cooperation. Sometimes those are seen as opposing forces, or we think as sort of tribal life and modernity are sort of opposing forces. But, I think people like many of the Scandinavian countries, I think, have found ways to merge those two pathways into one. So take, for example, the Danes. Danish life is, they're often ranked as the highest, happiest people on the planet consistently. And this is due to a combination of factors, including a robust welfare system, which, we're going to talk about a little bit more as a quality of trust, low income inequality, high levels of social trust, a strong sense of community, and the cultural practice. Here I go. Hygge, Hygge, if you speak Danish. Thrivology Lab at gmail.com. Please correct me, educate me.
But I believe send an audio clip.
I believe it's Hygge. And this idea, Hygge, is a cultural practice. It's part of their social identity, and it really translates to sort of comfort, coziness, and it extends to all different aspects of sort of the leisure life of like candlelights, fireplaces, natural materials in your furniture, cozy blankets, and it's also the people in that environment and the quality of the conversation. It's woven into every aspect of that sort of community, and particularly in countries where there's a long winter, darkness, cloudy, it's cold, having these warm, physically and conceptually warm spaces with people you love and trust would make sense why that would be so important. And
I think of a sauna.
Right, sure, right. Sauna, absolutely.
It is a community activity.
Right.
It's not just something you do alone. It's something you actually do with others. It's part of the social fabric.
And this comes from an article. As a quote, everyone sees what they do, referring to Hygge, everyone sees what they do to contribute without being asked. This makes the whole team flow better and no one gets stuck doing all the work. When everyone works together in preparing, serving, pouring, and conversing, then Hygge is in full bloom, but everyone has to understand they are part of a team. And that goes directly to what you were saying about the differences in individualistic and collectivist perspective. If I see myself as part of a social team, that, and we're going to talk later also about team, what that might mean. I think, again, the word choice of team is really telling. And that extends also to their welfare state, that they have not sort of huge wealth disparities in their people. They also have universal health care, education, right? All these things are taken care of. And this comes from a really great article, Why Danes Are Smug. Cross-national studies show that a prosperous economy and a well-functioning democracy are associated with a high level of well-being, although longitudinal studies of life satisfaction do not indicate any stable changes as a result of higher income. So it's not more money doesn't make more better necessarily, up to a point, right? But when there's less inequality across those domains, we see a higher degree of satisfaction. And then also, I think, for me, that comes up again with this idea of trust. And how we cultivate trust. And I went down this rabbit hole about looking at aging. So, part of, I think, the idea of thriving is it's not solely just to thrive now. We want not just a lifespan, but a health span. We want to, as we get older, continue to thrive and function really well. And part of that is about these relationships. And this comes from research by Haas and Poland. They conducted two studies. First, they found, they took surveys from almost 200,000 people across 83 countries and found that these are ages 14 to 99. As people got older, their level of trust increased, and that they also found that those correlated to increases in well-being. So the trust and the well-being is correlated. Here's a quote. In general, interpersonal trust is thought to be adaptive in that a basic sense of trust in other people allows human beings to derive support, comfort, and pleasure from others, facilitates pro-social behavior, and makes such behavioral beneficial for well-being. And to me, that seems sort of counterintuitive, because I think I would have thought that getting older, you're more susceptible to scams or being taken advantage of or being dismissed. And we'll talk a little later about more specifically about aging and why that might happen. But another thing that comes up in this research is the idea of cooperation. I think particularly in individualistic cultures, we tend to highlight the benefit of competition, and we pit it against cooperation. But time and time again, what we see is that, even in areas where competition seems to be at the forefront, say business or sports, cooperation is so critically important. So take a sports team. They're competing, yes, against another team, but that internally, that team has to be able to cooperate. And you see this across all sports. When there's infighting or disagreements within a team, they function poorly on the field or the court. But when there's a high level of trust and deep connection across that team, they function almost as a single unit. But then that cooperation has to extend to the other team. So I have to trust that the other team's not going to cheat, that they're not going to do something illegal, and we see this when athletes get found out for using performance enhancing drugs or something. We get very defensive against that because they've broken this bond, a social contract that says, sportsmanship is about playing by the rules that we all have sort of agreed to, and we trust and cooperate to those rules.
Yeah, I think about my martial arts training and the degree to which trust is necessary for a healthy learning environment. But that doesn't mean there isn't competition. Right. Those two actually coexist very much. You get into sparring, and it brings out everybody's competitive nature. Even some of the simpler sparring drills that are what we call push hands or centering in Hygge. And it's fun, it's play where we have to feel safe. We have to cooperate at some level so that we know the other person isn't actually trying to hurt us, isn't going to hurt us, and that's actually the best environment for learning and flourishing.
When I got started in Spartan races, I had the opportunity to do a training with a former Navy SEAL, Mark Devine.
Oh, yeah.
Commander Devine would use the term cooperation. This idea of because, even in a workout, surrounding myself with people who are we talked about this last episode with the Kohler effect, surrounding myself with people who are a little better than me and trying to compete, it helps me get better and stronger and faster, right? And so I'm using that social pressure competitively.
It ups my game.
It ups my game. But to your point, that has to be based in trust and cooperation, that it's not against that. I'm not competing against. Even the word competition comes from the Latin competire, and coming out of sort of the Greeks, going into the Romans, competire coming out of, say, the Olympics, right? The idea initially about the Olympics was not that you came as an athlete to the games to beat somebody else. You came so that each athlete raised the level of performance of all the others. One of the definitions of competire is to come together.
And just to loop back real quick, I think one of the things that I think is likely in that the aging and well-being that you're talking about is that we become more selective with our friends. So I think, when we're younger, we're often hyper-social, hypersensitive to feedback, and sometimes have 500 friends, but how many of them are real friends? If you have something happen in your life and you need help, how many of those people can you really rely on? I think as we age, we tend to get more selective, and we prune that back to a fewer number of more meaningful relationships. And a lot of the research points to that. It's more about the quality of these relationships than the quantity. Actually, having a whole lot of surface level friendships is negatively associated with health because it contributes to feelings of feeling alone and isolated, because you don't have that deep connection. It's that deep connection that gives you this kind of shared sense of purpose and caring and meaning.
One of the papers I found calls that the socio-emotional selectivity theory.
Oh, I like that.
Isn't that great?
It's a good name. So maybe there's a good opportunity to talk about loneliness a little bit too here, right? So if everything we're saying is true, and I of course think it is, right, that we are social animals, we are social species, and then feelings of loneliness should be very distressing to us. And this is exactly what the research shows. Essentially, in a nutshell, the more lonely you feel for longer periods of your life, the more health problems you will have and the shorter you will live. I mean, the research on loneliness is it's humbling. It makes you realize that this is really underappreciated as a public health issue. So the researchers in this area argue that we should look at loneliness the same way we look at the risk of smoking, obesity, cardiovascular health, because it actually has similar impacts on life expectancy. Right?
Incredible.
So it is very incredible, right? And so what it seems to do is it activates the body's stress response, the body's stress threat detection system. When we feel lonely, and it gets more about feeling lonely, it's not how many people are around you, it's how connected you feel with them, because you might be surrounded by people but feel alone.
Which goes to your point of being young and having a whole swath of friends, but I don't feel connected.
Well, and you see this sometimes with, famous actors or whatnot who have seemingly all this wealth and fame, and maybe, then sometimes there's a suicide attempt, right? And you wonder, like, how is someone who seems so happy on the surface and popular, has everything that everyone could, quote, ever want, but often there's this depression and this sense of loneliness and isolation that they're actually really struggling with. So if you're a social species, again, from that evolutionary perspective, being kicked out of the tribe can be a death sentence, quite literally, right? So we are designed to take negative feedback, or that is to say, feedback that we are being rejected or that our behavior is undesirable. We're very responsive to it. And feelings of loneliness, they literally raise our blood pressure. They raise our cortisol levels. And as we talked about in, I think it was the second mindfulness episode, chronic activation of your body's stress response system actually degrades the body over time, because what your body is doing is diverting energy from other systems, including your sleep system. It's kind of shutting down some of your digestion, and it's putting that toward short-term survival mechanisms. And so chronic activation of that is actually going to be really bad for your health. So this is a 2016 meta-analysis, and the title is Poor Social Relationships Were Associated with a 29% risk of incidence of chronic heart disease and a 32% increase in risk of stroke. Right? And the title says it all. You don't need to, right? Actually, that's not the title. Sorry, but that is a quote from the I think from the abstract. If you're chronically having high blood pressure because you feel alone, you're going to be at increased risk of heart disease and stroke. So this social rejection is a huge issue, and it shows up, like I said, in our mortality. So another meta-analysis, this is from 2010, there were 308,000 individuals involved in this, followed over 7.5 years, and basically inadequate relationships were associated with a 50% reduction in survival. Right? So healthy relationships, 50% boost in survival likelihoods. That's huge. And this is, again, this is equivalent to obesity, physical inactivity. And so, sometimes research compares the impact of loneliness on lifespan as being the equivalent of smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day. That's incredible, right? So this, I don't think we view it that way. We tend to view, again, we talked about this in other episodes. We have this kind of Cartesian dualism.
Right.
The mind, that's just in your head. If it's in your body, it's real. And of course, we've said that that's a very, very much a false dichotomy. And the research on social rejection looks at this very explicitly. And actually, they find that when you put people, again, in these kind of fMRI scanners, functional magnetic resonance imaging, if you expose them to physical pain, which we can do at small levels in the laboratory, or social rejection, which we can also do, that is felt in the same pain areas of the brain actually light up. It's the anterior cingulate cortex. So the in the scanner, it's like, how do you simulate social rejection in the scanner? This actually evolved out of a in-person laboratory. They would have people come into a waiting room to participate in a study. There would be 2 people already in the waiting room, so a participant comes in. They don't know the other 2 people are actually part of the experiment. So many social psychology experiments start this way. One of those people, there's a ball in the room. They pick it up. And they throw it to the I'll say the real participants, and they quickly wind up with a game of a catch. And then at some point, the 2 Confederates, the people who aren't real participants, start just passing it to each other. So these are people you do not know, right? There's no real stake here. But that's the experiment. And then the experimenter comes in and calls the actual participant. And the first thing the participant brings up is, do you believe those people? And they feel very hurt. So they actually do a virtual game in this where they say, we're interested in how brains coordinate together to play games. And so you're going to be playing this virtual game of catch in this, and we're going to have you in an fMRI scanner. And you're actually playing against a computer program that, again, in the beginning, it includes you in the game. And then at some point it rejects you, essentially, right? It starts just tossing the ball to the other two people and you don't get it. And they find that these same areas that are involved in physical pain light up with this social pain. And the part I love about this, it gets even better, is that if you have people take Tylenol first, they report less social pain.
Right.
Right? I mean, this is acetaminophen, right? Or a placebo. So you can, again, randomly assign people to take a placebo or acetaminophen. And if these things are processed in the same parts of the brain and experienced the same way, then you would hypothesize that something you would take to help with physical pain, I took some Tylenol this morning because my low back is a little achy, would also reduce social pain. That's exactly what they find.
Fascinating. Well, and if the anterior cingulate cortex sounds familiar to people, when we were talking about do hard things, we talked about the anterior mid-cingulate cortex, which is part of that cortical bundle that was associated with willpower and maybe even the will to live. So here we have activation, and they do different kinds of threat, similar threat. Like if you see a picture of a gun pointed away from you, or you see a picture of a gun pointed to you, the perception of that threat, even though it's just a picture, looks the same. But here you have a physical threat and a social threat activating that exact same area of the brain.
And you mentioned this will to live. This is something we see, particularly in older couples, where when someone dies, the other person very quickly seems to go downhill and die. And often that is exactly how it's described. It's as though they lost the will to live.
Yeah, well, there's one of the researchers, Rook and Charles, write about that, specifically saying the adverse health effects of a spousal bereavement may be due in part to hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis dysregulation, as suggested by evidence that bereaved individuals exhibit flatter diurnal cortisol slopes than do non-bereaved individuals. So there's this upside, like, yes, close, intimate, fewer, better quality relationships are better for us, but it is then that much harder when we lose those people.
Yep. Yeah, you lose a sibling, you lose a parent, you lose a child, you lose a spouse. These things are very hard on us, and it would make sense. It's the cost of being a social species in many ways.
We've covered a little bit already about sort of aging and trust in those things. We can come back to that maybe later. Do you want to give a little sort of tapas on social media?
Yeah, this is another one of those. You could easily do a whole a podcast series, but certainly a whole episode. And we probably will come back to this one because I think this is a really important one, especially when you look at adolescence. I'll say as you know, we're like, a 50-ish. And I think both of you and I have kind of a little bit of an aversion to social media.
Not a little bit. I have a complete aversion.
And we bring a bias that way, right? Like, I don't like it.
Yeah, right.
And so, and there is some research showing that it is actually bad for your health. But I'll say it is nuanced and complicated, because there are also times when it is good for your health, right? So COVID was an example of that, in that we were all forced into social isolation that did cause a lot of problems for people. Everything we've been talking about, and loneliness, when we were forced into social isolation, that negatively affected developmental growth in adolescence, in children, not just their learning in school, but they're learning how to interact with people, they're learning how to read emotions. But social media, that digital world, helped bridge that for many people and actually helped lessen that effect. And there's some research that even shows this in older adults, in that the more they were connected digitally, the better they fared through social media. And so I don't want to say that it is all bad, because clearly there are some benefits, and there also seem to be some benefits in marginalized groups, so LGBTQ or social anxiety, any group where you might feel socially isolated. Sometimes you can connect with people you actually know in real life, or connect with a group that you don't have access to where you physically live. And a lot of people actually find that social support really helpful and healthy, right? So again, these are areas of benefit. I'll talk a little bit about the costs. There is a correlation between increased social media use and increased perceptions of loneliness. Okay, and we've already talked about the problems with loneliness in terms of your health. So we know that the more time you spend on social media, the more you tend to feel lonely, the more likely you are to report being depressed, the more likely you are to report health problems. Now, that is correlational research that I'm mentioning there, but there is actually experimental use where they kind of randomly assign people to two different conditions. One group is asked to continue their current social media use, and the other one is asked to limit their activity. They weren't asked to completely go off of it because that's very hard for people to do, but to limit their time to 10 minutes per app per day. And they were actually asked to do screenshots of their activity summaries to verify that they were complying with these. And I'm just going to read a quote here. Using less social media than you normally would leads to significant decreases in both depression and loneliness. These effects are particularly pronounced for folks who were more depressed when they came into this study. And again, just to nuance this a little bit further, one of the things that we see is that the negative impacts of social media often are worse on adolescent females than they are on adolescent males. And so there's what we call problematic social media use. This is a category that looks at social media use as almost addictive, where you feel compelled to check it. You're spending enough time on it where it might be disrupting your sleep. This is an issue certainly for adolescents. It might be contributing to your social isolation because you're now not going out and doing other things. You're not as physically active as you might be. And all these, once you start looking at the negative effects, it does seem to impact females more so than males, but it's negative for both. And the way I've heard some researchers frame it, it's not so much that the social media use is bad. There is some research about FOMO and fear of missing out and that social comparison that we can at least briefly touch on. But a lot of it is about what you're not doing. Right, so all those hours that you are on social media, that's time where you could be interacting face-to-face with people, where you could be outside, where you could be moving physically, all these other things that are good for well-being. So at the point that social media starts to reduce those things, that's where it becomes problematic. And it seems that tipping point is about 2 or 3 hours a day. And as you and I know, talking with our students, many of them are way over that number. 5 hours per day is not a high number for our students to self-report in terms of usage. So that's a lot.
Yeah. And I think, again, I think that nuance is important. I mean, they're tools. And if we use them as tools, but when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, like figuring out where we put that tool is important.
Yeah, and that I mentioned just briefly this fear of missing out, which is referred to as FOMO, right? And we all know people in our lives whose social media, their relationship looks perfect. We see them together on all these fancy vacations. They're always happy, and then we find out they're separated. They were actually completely miserable one day, and it seems like a total surprise, right?
Yeah.
And so this is one of the things that happens with kind of excessive social media use. We tend to curate our social media profiles much like we would write a Christmas letter. Right. We talk about all the good things in our life, and we don't actually share often what we're struggling and what is actually going wrong in our relationships. And so if I'm looking at social media, it seems like, wow, everyone else is happy except me. Well, that contributes to feelings of isolation and loneliness because I feel like there's something wrong with me. But the reality is that those are fictions that you're seeing in other people's social media. That's not their full. That's a very curated.
It's entertainment.
Yeah. It's entertainment, and it's them trying to present their best selves. Their maybe their aspirational self. Right. But it is not what they are actually struggling with on a daily basis.
We are about out of time. We didn't set up in our notes a challenge for this week.
Yeah, but I think. We could come up with one on the fly.
How about you find a friend you haven't connected with in a while and meet for coffee? Like have a coffee date.
Yeah.
Real people, real time.
Real people, real time. And I will say for me personally, I have to be intentional about doing those things.
Yeah.
I have tendencies towards self-isolation.
Yeah, I do too. Yeah.
Right? And I have to put myself out there and go spend time with friends. And it's not that I don't enjoy it. I do. But I find that increasingly I'll realize that I've not interacted with anyone outside of work in quite a while, and that's not good for me.
Yeah.
So.
All right, my friends, that is it for this episode. Please subscribe to the Thrivology Lab on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Leave a comment or question on YouTube, and we will be sure to respond. And talking about social media, be sure to follow us on Instagram or Facebook. Use it as a tool.
That's right. Don't overuse it.
If you have questions or comments, or there's a subject you'd like to hear us discuss, please reach out to thrivologylab@gmail.com. Thrive on, friends.
Thrive on.